Yeah, come on up. So welcome to the American Enterprise Institute and to today's event, The Life and Legacy of Alexander Hamilton, a discussion of Professor Sylla's new book, Alexander Hamilton, The Illustrated Biography. I'm Paul Kupiak. I'm a scholar here at AEI. And let me say that I'm truly pleased to be able to bring together four exceptionally knowledgeable scholars for our discussion this afternoon. We're still missing one. He's probably stuck in traffic, but I'm sure he'll make it. Professor Dick Sylla is legendary among American financial historians. He literally wrote the book when it comes to the history of interest rates. I look forward to Dick's wit and insights as he recounts for us the many accomplishments of Alexander Hamilton as a founding father and the legacy of many important institutions and practices that were fashioned by the hand of Hamilton and still guide our nation today. Hamilton's legacy and accomplishments, well documented in Professor Sylla's book, are truly amazing. In the short amount of time I have for an introduction, I scarcely have time to mention even a partial list of Alexander Hamilton's accomplishments. So I decided instead it'd be a lot easier to mention things that Alexander Hamilton didn't do. So based on extensive research, I can say with virtual certainty that Alexander Hamilton did not write the first American cookbook. I think Fannie Farmer did that in 1896. Nor did Hamilton write our national anthem. Now, I don't want to be too critical here at Dick's book, but I read the book pretty carefully, and I don't think Dick ever mentioned these facts. So anyway, enough of me, and let me introduce our distinguished speakers for today's event. Professor Richard Sylla, the Henry Kaufman Professor of the History of Financial Institutions and Markets at New York University Stern School of Business. Dick's research focuses on the history of money, banking, and finance. He's the author of many well-known books, including A History of Interest Rates. His writings appear in numerous scholarly journals. He served as the president of the Economic History Association and the Business History Conference, and he is currently the chairman of the Museum of American Finance in New York City. We also have a distinguished panel of scholars here to discuss the portrayal of Alexander Hamilton in Dick's book. Carlos Ramirez, a professor of economics at George Mason University and a resident scholar at the FDI Center for Financial Research, his research focuses on bank history and regulation, deposit insurance, macroeconomics, international finance, and U.S.-China relations. Dick SICILLIA, who's not with us yet, he just made it. David, I'm sorry, is associate professor and associate director of graduate studies in the Department of History and the Henry Kaufman Fellow in Business History at the Center for Financial Policy at the University of Maryland in College Park. His research focuses on the evolution of U.S. and global capitalism. He's the author of many books, most recently, The Greenspan Effect, Words That Move the World's Markets. He's widely published in scholarly journals and makes many appearances on international network news interviews. John Joseph Wallace is professor of economics with the University of Maryland and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research focuses on the public finance of American governments, constitutional developments, and the institutional development of governments and economies. He is author of many scholarly books and articles, his most recent being Violence and Social Orders, a conceptual framework for interpreting recorded human history. So let me welcome Professor Sylla for a discussion of the life and times of Alexander Hamilton.
Thank you, Paul, and obviously thanks to AEI for sponsoring this event, and it's really great to be back with Paul, who was a colleague of mine in our North Carolina days, some decades ago, and these other three chaps are old and dear friends. Carlos, I hadn't seen him for a while. He didn't have so much gray hair last time I saw him, but I guess that's what George Mason will do to you. And David SICILLIA, the last time I saw him was last night in New York, where Henry Kaufman, they mentioned I was the Henry Kaufman professor. Henry Kaufman was the old Wall Street economist, Dr. Doom of the 1970s, was launching a new book, I think his fourth book, and David is his editor. So we were there launching Henry's book, and something we're going to talk about later on, but Henry Kaufman last night, his book is called what? The Tectonic Shifts in the Financial Markets. Henry started out last night by saying, you know, the financial markets are really extremely important. The financial system is really extremely important to us. And then he went on to say that there are things going on. You know, it's kind of a contest between fiduciary responsibility that financial institutions should have, taking care of our hard-earned money, retirement funds and so on, and the entrepreneurial approach to finance where, you know, Wall Street's, you know, caricature, you want to make as much money as possible, you know, steal from your grandmother if you have to. And there's a tension between the fiduciary responsibility of our financial institutions and the entrepreneurial instinct to make a lot of money. And Henry thinks we get out of balance on that. So, but anyway, the thing I liked, and this is important for understanding Hamilton, is that he had this same idea that the financial system was really extremely important. And when he was around as a young soldier and working for the Constitution, we didn't have much of a financial system. But just a few years later, when he stepped down as Secretary of the Treasury, we had pretty much the modern financial system. Not quite like today, but what I'm going to call the key elements of it were there. So that's David, and of course John Wallace and I have been working on projects since the early 1980s or something like that, and a lot of pleasurable academic collegiality, cooperation, working on the same research projects. John and I have enjoyed that, or at least I have, John. I'm not sure how much you did. All right, this you know, what looks like a big book. The reason I didn't talk about Alexander Hamilton's cookbook or whatever else Paul mentioned, that, you know, things that Hamilton did not do, is because it looks like a big book, and it is a big book, but it's really, in terms of the text that I wrote, not really all that long. It's 50 to 60,000 words, I'm saying like that. The reason the book is so big is because of all the lavish illustrations that are in it, and there was not another book like this. There are some very long biographies that sometimes have a few pictures tucked in the middle, but nothing quite where the artwork is so extensive. And that was when the idea was presented to me. I said, I'm a financial historian. I want to write a serious academic book about Hamilton's, you know, where his policies came from, the execution of his financial plan while he was Secretary of the Treasury, and its impact on our history. That's what really interested me. But of course, you can't be studying that all your life without picking up all kinds of other interesting things. And so this represented a chance to say what Hamilton did, not only financially, but in other areas as well. And I thought that was a challenge. And of course, it's inspired by the craze set off by the musical Hamilton. Vast numbers of people today who probably never heard of Alexander Hamilton before or knew much about him are suddenly very interested in this very interesting man. So we live in an age of the rediscovery of Alexander Hamilton. Through most of my life, which goes back to the 1940s, Hamilton's been in the shadows of American history. I write about that in the book. And, you know, it's because I would say the trends were, from the time I began to understand what was going on in the world, which might have been in the 1950s, the liberals were kind of running the country, Keynesian economics, and there was a kind of anti-business slant, I would say, from the 1920s even through the Depression. Of course, those are reasons for it. But even after the post-war, you know, businessmen were in a little better shape in the 50s and 60s than they were before that. But there was still a notion that they were not such savory characters, and therefore Hamilton, you know, was the guy who was pro-business and pro-finance and pro-Wall Street, and so he was a bad guy. That's when I was young. Then all of a sudden in the 1960s and 70s, the country turned a little more conservative, and the anti-government slant, I guess, came up a little bit. The government is not the solution to our problems. The government is the source of our problems. We can call folks who believe that way conservatives or libertarians. And they didn't like Hamilton, not because he was pro-business, but because he was a big government guy. And the big government is really the source of most of our problems today. Of course, nobody talks that way anymore, so we can be glad that these problems are pretty much behind us now. But anyway, Hamilton's coming out. So anyway, neither liberals nor conservatives like Hamilton, and that's why he was in the shadows. And he was, so much in the shadows that just a couple of years ago, Jack Lew, the then Secretary of the Treasury, talked about taking Hamilton off the $10 bill. And fortunately, the musical probably saved him, and there was a lot of. But now we're rediscovering Hamilton after he's been in the shadows for so many years. He wasn't always in the shadows. He was big in his own lifetime. He was big in the Civil War to the 1920s. Theodore Roosevelt wrote about him. Henry Cabot Lodge wrote about him. A man named Herbert Crowley in The Promise of American Life wrote about Hamilton. He was ahead. But then that sort of ended in the 1920s. What's being rediscovered, which we Hamiltonians always knew, is that Hamilton may have well been the most important of the founding fathers, if being most important is the one who made the decisions and gave us the institutions that sort of reflect what the country is today. In other words, the ball got rolling in Hamilton's era, and it kept on rolling. Hamilton started banks, and we had more and more banks. And so by the early 20th century, we had the biggest banking system in the world, more bank deposits than Germany, France, and Britain put together. A lot of people don't know that. We also know that by the early 20th century, we're talking 100 years ago now, the United States was pretty big on corporations, another one of Hamilton's, something that Hamilton pushed. In fact, somebody's done a census of corporations in the world as of around 1910 or 11 or 12. There were something like 450,000 corporations in the world then, and 270,000 of them, 60% were in the United States of America. So you had the most corporations in the world, which is still true. You had the world's largest banking system. This is before the 20th century, which Henry Luce pronounced as the American century. Already at the beginning of the 20th century, we had more corporations than any other country. We had more banks than any other country. Our financial markets, Britain was still considered the financial capital up to World War I, but the U.S. had financial markets that were roughly as big as Britain's. So what Hamilton was, to some extent, responsible for getting us moving in that direction. We could say today that he put us on this path which turned us into an economic, financial, and political superpower. He was also in favor of strong defenses, and the United States today is armed to the teeth with, if not the world's largest military in terms of soldiers, we certainly have the world's most expensive military. And Hamilton would have liked that. Not everyone does, but Hamilton would have liked that. More importantly, we're blessed with constitutional government, and the legislative, executive, judicial branches, each with its own area, lots of checks and balances between them. And Hamilton was one of the important architects of that. So in short, some, not just I, but some other writers on Hamilton said, when Americans can thank Alexander Hamilton for making us safe, free, and rich. Safe, free, and rich. That's Hamilton's legacy to America. There were some pictures being flashed when we came in of Hamilton's birthplace, and a picture of the island of Nevis, which is not very big. It's sort of a mountain that comes out of the ocean. That Hamilton could do so much of this was kind of remarkable given his very disadvantaged childhood, which is one of the things where the musical resonates. He was from, as the musical says, right at the beginning, Aaron Burr walks out and says, "How does a bastard, orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman stuck on the island in the middle of the ocean, go on and become the $10 founding father without a father?" So he had a very humble beginning, I would say. But even if he'd been, a rich planter slaveholder, like his friend George Washington or his rivals Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, or if he came from an old line of middle-class achievers like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, what Hamilton did would still be exceptional, but it seems even more interesting given his humble background. Yet, in this period when Hamilton was in the shadows, there's a poet named Ezra Pound. I never read much of Ezra Pound's poets, and he apparently went nuts in his old age, but he pronounced Alexander Hamilton to be, quote, the prime snot of American history. I never figured out what Pound meant by that, but it was just people have strong feelings about Hamilton. So Hamilton was the prime snot of American history. And I think part of the reason for that is if we come through an age in the last few decades, or number of decades, most of my lifetime, where Jefferson and Madison and maybe even John Adams, thanks to David McCullough, are big national heroes, well, then you find if you read about Jefferson and Madison and John Adams, that they tangled all the time with Alexander Hamilton. So maybe that's what made Hamilton the prime snot of American history. All these other very admirable figures Hamilton was fighting with a lot. Hamilton isn't easy to peg, I would say, and I talk a lot about this in the book, because he seemed to have I and my colleagues here, I would say we're all thinkers. We do research and write books and articles and stuff like that. We're academics. We're thinkers. And, a lot of people in the world are doers. And the thing that I think that Hamilton was both a thinker and a doer, and not just in one area. I mean, obviously James Madison was a thinker and a doer when it comes to structuring a government. Jefferson was probably a thinker and a doer when it talked about libertarian ideals. So he put some of his thinking into practice. But Hamilton was a thinker and a doer on a number of fronts. He was a soldier. You can think of, independence was one of his goals. When Hamilton was 17 and 18 years old, he wrote 30, 40-page essays on why America ought to be an independent country. These were published before the battles of Lexington and Concord, based on discussions of natural law. 17, 18 years old, 30, 40, 50-page essays. One was called A Full Vindication of the Measures of Congress. Another one was called The Farmer Refuted, where the farmer was supposedly a defender of Britain. But then Lexington and Concord occur a couple of months after Hamilton's second essay. He immediately takes some of his fellow students at King's College, now Columbia University, and starts drilling them into a military force because war has broken out and we have to do something. The next thing you know, Hamilton is a captain of the New York Artillery, raising an artillery company of 100 and some people. He predicted the war. In the book, I talk about Hamilton actually outlines the military strategy for the United States in the war. The 17 or 18-year-old kid. It's basically called the Fabian strategy. You don't work so much to win, but you do work a lot not to lose. And then maybe the other guy gets tired of it, and you achieve your objective. So he thought about that, wrote about the strategy, and then he's a soldier. He fights with Washington in the battles of New York, Long Island and so on. Didn't go very well for the U.S. He covers Washington's retreat across New Jersey after those bad battles at the fall and early winter of 1776. And then Washington goes into Pennsylvania, and on Christmas night they cross the Delaware and win the Battle of Trenton. Hamilton is there. Hamilton's artillery is part of the Battle of Trenton. Then they go north to Princeton, early 1777. Hamilton gets revenge against Princeton, which didn't admit him as a student. Why didn't they admit him? This is a great problem of being admitted to college. Well, Hamilton walks in as a brash kid from the West Indies, saying, "I'm in a hurry." Hamilton always seemed to be in a hurry, and I want to do your 4-year program in 2.5 years or something like that. And John Witherspoon, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, is the president of the College of New Jersey, which we call Princeton today. And he says, "Young man, at Princeton we do things the Princeton way. You can't get in here." So the poor kid has to go to Columbia, but. During the Battle of Princeton, Hamilton's artillery is trained on Nassau Hall, and Hamilton gets the pleasure. British soldiers are inside Nassau Hall, the oldest building at Princeton. And Hamilton gets the pleasure of shooting cannonballs into Nassau Hall. And I'm told that when students are taken to Princeton now, the students that give them guided tours, say, here's a mark in Nassau Hall. That this was Alexander Hamilton's cannonball where it hit. And, so he got his revenge. So he was a man of action and a thinker about the military. He was a congressman. He was the founder of banks. He wrote a lot about the theory of banking. He was a politician and a constitutionalist. He was a courtroom lawyer, but he also was a big legal thinker, a lot of legal principles, one of which I'll mention. And then he was a finance minister. I mean, he wrote about what a country should do in its finances, and then he became the finance minister. So there's this big body of writing, and all different, soldier, lawyer, constitutionalist, finance minister. Hamilton was good at all of them. Now I wanted to emphasize today, the legal thing, by the way, is judicial review, and this is Hamilton was a doer before he became a thinker. There's a new book out called Rutgers versus Waddington, and this is a famous legal case from 1784. And here's the story of it, in essence. Hamilton had just fought this war against the British. The Americans won. The treaty is signed in peace in 1783, September. New York State passes a bunch of laws taking away the property of Tories, discriminating against them. And a lot of Tories are leaving, sometimes under duress, losing their property. And Hamilton enters a legal case defending a Tory who's accused of, has to pay a lot of money because while the British occupied New York City, this Tory took over Patriots' Elizabeth Rutgers brewery and ran it for a few years. And after the war is over, Mrs. Rutgers sues Waddington, and Hamilton defends Waddington. But the essence of his argument is, we signed a peace treaty with Britain. That's like national law, New York state law, and then the peace treaty with Britain says we aren't supposed to mistreat the Tories. They're to be, treated nicely. And New York state wasn't doing that. So Hamilton says this treaty is like a national law which should take precedence over a state law. And this is the beginning of the idea of judicial review. And 4 years later, in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton in Federalist 78, gives this, rather interesting account of the role of the judiciary. We're having Judge Gorsuch is being interviewed in this town, I think, this week. And Hamilton is the person who, in Federalist 78, sort of outlines the role of the judiciary. And I listened to some of Mr. Judge Gorsuch's testimony, and it seemed to me that I could call him a Hamiltonian. It's the judges that's supposed to interpret the law and all that, and that's what Hamilton wrote about in Federalist 78. So he was a practicing lawyer, but he was also a legal thinker. I talk about his military career in the book, his opposition to slavery. Most of the books mention that he was opposed to slavery, but it's usually always in passing. And I put a whole chapter on Hamilton as an abolitionist, where at a number of points in his career, he took a strong stand against slavery. I think this is partly because he grew up in the West Indies, where 8 or 9 of every 10 people were black slaves. And Hamilton's mother owned slaves. It's likely that Hamilton grew up as a child in a household where there were a lot of black kids that he played with all the time. And when he's a soldier in the Army, he writes a letter to John Jay saying, we should offer the blacks the right to be in the Army, and they'll, of course, be emancipated if they come in the Army. And in that letter, he says, I think that the blacks are just as smart as the whites, but they've been given the fuzzy end of the stick in life. So Hamilton is the only founding father. Most of them thought, well, you could be against slavery, but you could still think that blacks and whites couldn't live together happily. And even Abraham Lincoln, until he was president, believed that, yes, we should abolish slavery, but since blacks and whites can't live together, you have to colonize them back to some place. Where Hamilton never had that idea. I mean, he had lived with blacks much of his life, and he had saw no problem with that. Neither did George Washington, I think. But I wanted to emphasize today, in the time, I'm already talking too long, since I have these fellow economic and business and financial historians with me, what Hamilton did in finance. I think that's the thing to emphasize, and I think it's the most important thing he did, because as Henry Kaufman said last night, we may not think about it, maybe we take it for granted, but the financial system is really very important to our lives. You know, think about the wonderful things it does. You know, Will Getzman at Yale has said the financial system is a technology for moving resources backward and forward in time. And you've all had experience of that, or direct or indirect anyway. Moving finances forward in time. You're young, you've gone to a good school, and you've got a good career, you're just starting out, you'd like to have a house, start a family. The financial system allows you to move resources from the future to the present so you can buy your house now. It's called a mortgage. And similarly, if you're like me, you know, you realize you're going to be old someday, and so you want to move resources not backward from the future to the present, but from the present when you're making a little money to the future when you're old and broken down. You know, I'm one of the Census Bureau's 320 million Americans broken down by age and sex. And so I am now, you know, retired. He said I was still the professor, but I actually became professor emeritus a year and a half ago. And so I'm very happy now. I'm having a pleasant retirement. And it's because I moved, the financial system allowed me to move resources forward in time from back when I was earning a little bit of money to the age. And that's what's really wonderful about it. But along with that, there's this, you know, people getting credit and all that, and entrepreneurs, you know, being financed in some way or other. That's part of it. Well, the U.S. didn't have much of a financial system. This is, I think, Hamilton's greatest achievement and one of the most important developments in American history that most of us have never really thought about. I've thought about it a lot because I'm a financial historian. And I probably should have brought a slide with this, but there are 6 key components of modern financial systems. I think you'll all agree with this. But remember them. There's the government itself has to be adequately financed. During the American Revolution, Hamilton saw the government wasn't adequately financed. The British were adequately financed, and therefore the revolution went on year after year after year. Hamilton thought we should have been whipping them easily on our home field, but that didn't happen. And he figured out somewhere in the middle of it that the reason was that the British were better financed than the Americans. So the Americans have to be better financed. But then Hamilton said, we can't do that with the current government structure under the Articles of Confederation, so we have to have a better form of government. So those 2 things, better government and better finance, were what Hamilton started working for from his time in the Army. So 6 key components of the modern financial system. We want the government itself to be well financed and to have a debt and to manage its debt effectively. A country ought to have its own money. Currency unit that solves a lot of problems if everybody agrees on what money is. It ought to have a central bank, and I'll say that with a central bank with a small c because it wasn't the same as the Federal Reserve, but it would be the government's bank and would be something of a regulator of the economy. And Hamilton could do something about all 3 of those. He could straighten out our public finances, which he started to do at the beginning of 1790. Then he gave us the dollar in his mint report of 1791, defining the dollar as a certain amount of gold and silver, the monetary base of the country, and of course his famous central bank, the first bank of the United States. By the way, he mentions the Bank of the United States in an essay 10 years earlier when he was a soldier in the Revolution. He talks about the Bank of the United States. He called for one then. 10 years later, 1791, he's in a position to get it. So he could do that. The public finance, the money, and the central bank. Hamilton, as finance minister, could introduce those things. But his plan was a little more elaborate. He wanted to have a banking system. He had founded the Bank in New York already. He recommended to Robert Morris to found the first bank when he was a soldier in 1781. He founded the Bank in New York in 1784, and now he's going to found the Bank of the United States in 17. And his Bank of the United States was partly owned by the government and partly owned by the public, the stockholders. 20% U.S. government, 80% stockholders. And at the end of this report, in a passage most people gloss over, I did myself for many years, the penultimate paragraph of that report says, and consider this, in this bank I'm proposing, the government is going to own 20% of the stock. And this is really a good thing because the dividends the bank will pay the government will be greater than the interest the government pays on the loan to buy its shares. And I think Hamilton was telling, people then didn't have television and YouTube and things like that. So they read these government reports. And Hamilton, that was what you did when you didn't have television and YouTube. And so Hamilton, when he says the government's going to turn a profit on its shares, I think he's telling all the people who read this, state legislators and so on, look, this bank is a gigantic corporation. You too should charter more banks and corporations, and if you're clever about it, you can actually make some money for your state government. So the next thing you know, banks are appearing all over the place, and like gave you the 100 years later result where we're the biggest banking in the system in the world by far, but Hamilton gets this ball rolling. When he becomes Treasury Secretary, there are 3 banks in the country. But then he founds the central bank, and by the time he steps down, there are 25, I think, banks plus 5 branches of the central bank. And by 1800, there's only 30 or 40, but by 1810, there's 100-some banks, and by 1820, there's 300 banks, and by the 1830s, there's 700, and by the Civil War, there are 1,600 banks, and by the early 20th century, there are tens of thousands of banks in the United States. I mean, they've all consolidated now. We have very big banks with a lot of branches. But I think, in the 1910s or 20s, when there were 25, 30,000 banks in the United States, it must have been like Starbucks today. You were never very far from a bank in the United States. So Hamilton gets that ball rolling. And then, of course, the securities markets, the capital markets, the stock market, the bond market. The New York Stock Exchange, which was founded in 1792 because there were a lot of new securities to trade, under the buttonwood tree on May 17, 1792. That's, sacred day to us New Yorkers. Down here in Washington, probably nobody knew that was the foundation of the New York Stock Exchange. But anyway, in those early years, it traded 5 securities: 3 U.S. government treasury bonds, the stock of the Bank of New York, and the stock of the Bank of the United States. That was the securities list in the middle of the 1790s. And what was the one characteristic they had in common? Every one was a creature of Alexander Hamilton. So he created these securities, and then people on Wall Street, the brokers, and that traded them. And the corporations. There were hardly any corporations in the U.S. in 1788. There are more corporations were created in 1791 and 92 under Hamilton than in all previous years of colonial and early American history. And as I mentioned later on, 100 years later, we have more corporations than anybody else in the world. So I think this was Hamilton's greatest achievement. I mean, I think today, government finance here in Washington, nobody will disagree, very important. Debt management, the dollar, the Treasury has to protect the dollar. The central bank, the current version, is the Federal Reserve, but it's a lineal descendant of Hamilton's first bank of the United States. The banking system, the securities markets, corporations, big parts of our lives. They were not big in 1788. They were starting to mushroom by 1795, and I think that's Hamilton's greatest gift to the country, because I think he was the only one who had it figured out how important it was. Like, he was like Henry Kaufman last night. Alexander Hamilton in the 1780s knew that finance was very important, and for 2 reasons, which he wrote in a letter to Robert Morris in 1781. Where the banks, he said, are the happiest engines ever invented for advancing trade. And furthermore, a bank like a central bank or a bank in the United States really strengthened the government. So the central bank and a financial system in general would make a government stronger, but these institutions would also make an economy grow. And I think Hamilton was in the forefront of realizing that finance was good for the government, would build a stronger government, and it would aid the growth of the economy. So I think I about run out of time now, and I want to hear my esteemed fellow economic, financial, and business historians what they have to say about these wild, radical ideas I have. Thank you. Carlos, are you up to bat first?
Yeah, I guess so.
It's kind of an obstacle course here, Paul.
We don't make it easy. I put the PowerPoint slides there. There you go. Thanks.
Oh.
Okay, so I put just a few PowerPoint slides just to ease my discussion here of Dick Sylla's book. Paul Kupiec sent me an email, invited me to discuss Professor Sylla's book, and it took me all of 5 seconds to agree. I first met Professor Sylla more than 20 years ago when I was still a grad student. And over the years, he's been in and out, and we come sometimes overlap on conferences. But I remember the first time I met him, I was extremely intimidated, because as graduate students, you meet all these famous professors and whatnot. It's like, oh no, I'm not worthy. And so I was very, very pleased to have the opportunity to discuss Professor Sylla's book. I'm still going to call him professor out of respect. Actually, I'm sure you know there's tons and tons of biographies about Hamilton throughout the ages. You can go all the way back to even earlier than Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge used to be a senator, a congressman also. He also a PhD in history, actually, from Harvard. He also did his law degree from Harvard and his bachelor's degree from Harvard. So he was a well-known scholar for many years. And he wrote a book. I did not read the entire biography that Henry Cabot Lodge wrote, but parts of it. But essentially, you can see the list, and that list is highly, highly incomplete. If you go through, you do a Google Scholar, you find tons and tons of books. And so then, so Professor Sylla is in a very steep competition here in terms of biographies. So we're talking actually today about his book. And what I want to highlight is many of the aspects that he already kind of alluded to in his talk. All right, one of the key things that he mentions towards the last, I guess, half of the talk is the issue of finance and growth, right? And so that actually, in a sense, makes this book particularly different. And the angle that he picks is, from that perspective, very, very useful for us academics, researchers in here. As Paul Kupiec mentioned earlier, Professor Sylla is extremely well known in financial and economic history. I think he also is from Harvard. He graduated not that long ago, actually, relative to Hamilton. It's just yesterday. Just kidding. Yes. And he has made extremely very influential contributions to the field, and I'll give you two. One, Paul Kupiec mentioned, he put together this very important book. He's still highly cited. Last time I checked, it's close to 2,000 citations on the history of interest rates. So that one is still very much is like a standard book in that. The second, and he sort of talked about in his discussion of the book, it's the observation that financial market development, in a sense, precedes economic growth and economic development in general. And that it's the point I want to kind of sort of focus my discussion on here. There's just a couple of minutes. That topic, the notion of economic growth and the linkage to the financial development. And by the way, when I say financial development, I mean in a broad sense, the infrastructure that you need to have contracts operating, the infrastructure that you need to kind of get moving resources from savers to borrowers, all that apparatus, it's actually quite complex, and it needs to be established, well established, and run smoothly for an economy to move forward. Well, that particular linkage between financial development and economic growth in general, actually it's still an ongoing area of research in macroeconomics and development in general. And there are so many early contributions. More than 50, 60 years ago, there's a Gurley and Shaw, I remember reading when I was a grad student. There is a Raymond Goldsmith who made very important contributions in that topic too. And then Alexander Gerschenkron, who was at Harvard for many years. And I remember one of my professors asking me, you got to read that book, economic backwardness in historical perspectives. Okay, all right, so I read that one. all of those very important early contributions. But despite all that evidence, despite all that research, right, that topic continues to be undecided, hasn't not been. There's another set of economists who disagreed the notion that financial development is necessary for economic growth. Part of the problem, in my view, is the chicken and egg problem, okay? You got the financial development and then you got economic growth. Well, which one comes first? So you've got this simultaneity thing going on, and people say, well, no, I disagree. I think you need the economy to sort of kind of get going, and then after the economy gets going, then finance follows, and then of course then that keeps speeding up economic development, but the first starting point was you gotta have the economy rolling. Others disagree, saying no, you need financial development first. Now imagine a bunch of nerdy economists trying to disentangle which one comes first. Over the last 30 years, the way they've been trying to settle this dispute is by relying on very technical models or very fancy econometric techniques to try to sort of see if they can sort of parse out which one comes first or second. And then here comes Professor Sylla saying, well, why don't we look at the perfect natural event, which would be you have a country that has nothing, right? Now, all of a sudden, you have an individual who thinks clearly about how to set this up, puts it together, and see how it comes about. So his angle in illustrating or sort of making this point clearly is through historiography. And I think that makes this book particularly unique and very different from all that set of biographies out there that are competing with Professor Sylla's book in here. So there are two particular examples I want to show you that are from the book to sort of kind of get you to that, to think a little bit about that chicken-egg problem and how he tries to solve it in here. One he mentioned is that soon after he created the Bank of the United States, tons of other banks started springing up. By the way, I don't think he mentioned it, but the Bank of the United States was oversubscribed when he was first, it's still issued in there. And that's a very, at least in my view, very, very clear piece of evidence out there. And the second, which a lot of people don't take for granted and whatnot, you guys, you all know that I think it was Jefferson engineered the purchase of the Louisiana from the French. Cost about $11 million. The U.S. had to borrow most of it, okay? Without a credible financial system, a credible debt, the U.S. government would not have been able to borrow money from Europe to finance that purchase. They put, I think, $3 million worth of gold in deposit, but the rest was financed through bond issues that were orchestrated and sold primarily in Europe and then got here. And so those are two kind of key components that would not have been possible without the infrastructure, the financial infrastructure that he was discussing in the book that Hamilton engineered and put together. It's something that something that has to be highlighted, I think, and it's more than in my view, it's a way of kind of presenting that natural event, the natural event. That's kind of like the famous things that people like to do now, natural. And so, in essence, what's the bottom line? Is actually without this financial infrastructure, you wouldn't have been able, the U.S. would not have been able to take off the way it did. Especially through the early 1900s, the birth of the manufacturing and everything that sort of follow up like that. Now, Professor Sylla has done a lot of work on this topic, I think even since the 70s, has a lot of colleagues who work with him. Not like that, I wasn't fortunate enough to have collaborated with him, but I read a lot of his literature and papers that he's written over the years, And you can kind of see that they are somewhat here hidden in some of the chapters that he talks about in the book, which I find it particularly useful for as a scholar here. So in a nutshell, what I want to kind of wrap it up just with this last PowerPoint slide, Hamilton and Illustrated Biography, well, yeah, of course, Sylla does a tremendous job at laying out the interesting life of Hamilton and all the contributions that he made, political, legal, military, economic, social, all that stuff. And that's great, that's fantastic. He actually does it very elegantly. But then, of course, that part, well, he competes with other biographies out there. One different angle, of course, is the illustration, which I think actually I appreciate very much because it helps visualize, kind of put it in a context, what's going on there. So I think that the pictures complement the narrative that he puts together in the book. So I've appreciated that very much. But I think the book is much more than just those two things put together. I think the book really sort of consolidates a lot of his views that he's put together over the years and really sort of, in a sense, articulates and puts it in a very clever way the mechanism by which financial development really speeds up or simulates economic growth. So from that particular angle, I think that the book is an incredibly important contribution to the literature. And of course, I highly recommend it. Thank you very much.
Watch your step there. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. AEI has done great things. It continues to do great things. I still assign Herbert Stein's book, Presidential Economics, in my classes. Terrific book. So I'm delighted to be here. What I'm going to do, Paul said we could do whatever we want, so you asked for it. And he also said we have 10 minutes, so my little gimmick for staying within my 10 minutes is I was thinking they had these guys in World War I called 4-minute men who would run around the country giving 4-minute long little patriotic speeches. So I'm going to be a 1-minute man and give you 10 1-minute speeches. Actually, I'll do 8 because I've just used up my first 2 minutes. And I'm going to do these by having, in this age of kind of alternative facts, right? I'm going to just have each one of my 10 1-minute speeches introduced by a simple, straightforward, declarative sentence, all right? So number 1, Dick Sylla is the greatest living U.S. financial historian, and I will debate that with anyone who wants. He's accomplished this through 4 decades of consistently steady, high-quality work in the form of articles and book chapters. For many years, Dick was, if someone was doing an edited volume on some aspect of American business or economic development, and they needed the chapter on finance, Dick was the go-to guy. I imagine at times it was kind of lonely because there's like economic history, and then there's business history, and then there's financial history. And especially back then, there were just a small handful of people, Herman Cruz, Vince Caruso, Robert Sobel, they're all gone. And so I imagine it was a little bit lonely at times, but thanks in part, in large measure, to Dick Sylla, also in large measure to the 2008 financial crisis, there's been a kind of new flowering of financial history. You know, there's a saying that when the market falls 5%, you call your broker. If it falls 50%, you call a historian. And I know that, Dick got a lot of phone calls after 2008, and I was delighted to see him appearing in the press a lot. So I told Dick last night at this Henry Kaufman event that the big academic organization in business history is called the Business History Conference. We have an incoming president, Mary O'Sullivan from the University of Geneva, who's a financial historian, and she just announced the theme for 2008, Money, Finance, and Capital. And I'm the program chair, so we're really going to rig the whole thing. It's great. Inside job. And I want to read to you from the call for papers that just went out 48 hours ago. For many years, Mary said, Professor O'Sullivan said, the abstruse and elusive character of these phenomena, meaning financial history and its connection with economic development, encouraged many historians of economic life to maintain a safe distance from them. Of course, there have always been some historians, I'm pointing at you, Dick, willing to figure out where money, finance, and capital fit into broader histories of our society. Still, much of what we know about currency and credit, investment and profit, bonds and futures, results from highly specialized research whose technical quality reinforces the enigmatic character of those subjects. So Dick was one of the brave pioneers of the field, help us understand how banks, exchanges, and other institutions, as well as financial markets, operated, and often raising us to the level of broad interpretation and synthesis. I'm sure Dick will be pleased to see what's happening in financial history now, and I want to thank him on behalf of everyone in the field for helping to build the foundation. So that was more than 1 minute, so let me do a couple of quickies. Number 2, Hamilton, the book, weighs more than almost any history book I have ever lifted. I have this odd habit of kind of collecting business history titles. For instance, there's one written by Harvey Firestone called Men and Rubber, 1926, or Bertram Fowler's study of meatpacking, Men, Meat, and Miracles. But Dick's book weighs more than that, but it doesn't. It seems almost anorexic compared to the Harvard Business School's official self-published 1986 history of delicate experiments. So still fell a little short there, Dick, on the weight. Number 3, back to Dick for a moment. I'm glad he mentioned Henry Kaufman. Henry Kaufman, who built his career at Salomon Brothers by developing what became the world's leading fixed income research department and 3 other departments. And no one, this is number 3, I want to say a little more about him because Dick is the emeritus Henry Kaufman professor at NYU. No single benefactor has done more to support the teaching of financial history than Dr. Henry Kaufman, who was probably the first person with a PhD in economics to work on Wall Street. He's endowed 4, about to endow a 5th at the University of Maryland chair in the teaching of business and financial history, supported the Museum of American Finance, and on and on and on. And this new book that he just announced, Tectonic Shifts in Financial Markets, includes a chapter titled The Present Value of Financial History. So Henry Kaufman's fond of saying money matters, but credit counts, which brings me to my 4th point about Hamilton the man, and the emphasis, I'm sticking with the emphasis on the financial aspects of Hamilton's career, because for me they also stand out, along with his role in defining our constitutional order, securing our national defense, challenging slavery. So one of the things that Hamilton really understood in the realm of banking and finance, my 4th point, his key insight about the dispensation of a new nation's debt and about the importance of a sound banking system, had an incalculable positive impact on setting our nation on its course to become the world's largest and most vibrant economy. And Dick talked about that. I'm really glad that he elaborated on that. So without the kind of financial system that Hamilton, more than any other citizen of the world at the time, envisioned and helped build, our nation could not have engaged in international trade or executed large land purchases. nor would the U.S. have come to possess, as Dick said, more banks, more corporations, and so on than any other economy on earth. It was this financial and business revolution that enabled the growth and spread of technological systems such as the railroad. So I'm picking up on what Professor RAMIREZ said. There's this interesting debate. I studied under the great Alfred D. Chandler, and for him, the railroad was the kind of lever that launched the economic development. But other scholars, sorry for the inside baseball chat a little bit, but say Thomas Cochrane talked about something called the business revolution, this development of the institutions that Hamilton was right at the center of. Insurance companies, exchanges, corporations were the necessary precursor, the financial revolution that allowed those other things to happen. This is a lesson still too easily forgotten. I imagine Dick cringes as I do when some of our politicians, for political posturing during debates about the budget, but perhaps with some sincere intent, toy with the notion, for instance, of defaulting on U.S. treasuries. When would it ever be a good idea to undermine the single most secure leading financial instrument in the world by suggesting that it should not be backed by the full faith and credit of the federal government? Or consider Greece. If Greece ultimately decides to leave the Eurozone, there's good ways to do it and bad ways to do it. Probably what will happen, alas, is that in a burst of enthusiasm, they'll say to all the EU debtors, oh, forget about it, huh? We're not paying it back anything, and they'll devalue their currency, which would destroy their ability to borrow for probably at least a generation or more, instead of, say, repaying their debt, as Hamilton knew our country should, but just, doing it on a somewhat more forgiving schedule. So I think the Greeks need to read their Hamilton. Unlike other books on Hamilton, by the way, this is the only one I've seen that situates Hamiltonism in an international perspective. Number 5, Aaron Burr was a terrible shot. That may sound silly because he hit his target, but there's a lot of controversy and we can't really know because Dick explains that Burr never talked to anybody, but he may have been intending to graze his target and was such a bad shot that he killed his target. And ironically, that happened on the same piece of real estate in New Jersey where Hamilton's own son had been killed in a duel. Number 6, serious academics secretly like illustrated books just as much as everyone else. Anybody want to disagree with me on that one? Nope. I love the people in American studies, they gave us a term called popular culture, So when I'm watching a crappy TV show, The Bachelor or something, my wife is like, what are you doing? I say, well, I'm studying American popular culture. All right, related to that, number 7, many readers will be tricked when they buy and read Hamilton, but in a good way. Rather than finding a book in which compelling images are the container for a book written by a non-expert who knows how to turn a phrase, instead, they will find a beautifully illustrated book by an expert who knows how to turn a phrase. There's a real book in there. There's a great book in there. Sneakily, they will learn a lot. I do this kind of thing at the University of Maryland. I teach half my courses in the business school. I never call them history of capitalism or history of financial markets. I call them development or evolution. But I get them in there, I trick them, and then I've got them and I show them that history matters. And finally, number 8, well, I've said a lot of very flattering things about Dick and his career and his work today, but as a true academic, I have to be critical. And so the story's not all sweet. My final point is that Dick Sylla has had a less successful career on Broadway playing the lead role in Hamilton the musical. Now, wait a second. Now, I'm citing here no less an authority than the President of the United States, who tweeted the following after seeing the show, with Dick starring in the role of Hamilton. Hamilton is a great man doing great work. Notice the present tense. Apparently, maybe Hamilton knows Frederick Douglass, who's also apparently still alive. Maybe they're friends. He did a good thing, and he's talking about Hamilton now. He did a good thing by inventing the $5 bill. So there's a number of issues there. And then, of course, 140 characters, there's a second tweet. But the guy who plays Hamilton needs a lot more big, fluffy hair. So that was, and then very sad. So, all right, so maybe a couple of alternative facts did slip in there.
Hi, my name is John Wallace. I met Dick in September of 1983, just down the road in Georgetown. I'd just come to the University of Maryland. I was an assistant professor, and the economic history meetings were in DC that year. And Dick came up to me at the meetings and said we should talk. He had just was working on a paper about the financial history of North Carolina. And I had worked on the New Deal, the 1930s, and was very interested in federalism, the interaction of national and state governments during the New Deal, and was interested in gathering financial statistics. And at that time, there were very few consistent statistics of state governments before 1900, and only some scattered numbers up until really 1940 or so. And so Dick and I started a project. Ultimately, we got National Science Foundation funding for 6 or 8 years, collecting state and local government documents. And so in my basement, I have 2,000 years of Xeroxes of state and local governments. So we did this with John Legler, who's since passed away. We had a great time doing this, and part of this was playing golf. So I'd go down to North Carolina, Dick would come up here, we'd go to places, and we'd always play golf. And Dick would say, "Young man, you Jeffersonians just don't understand." And I was like, "No, I really don't. I don't understand." And it took me a long time, because I was a New Deal historian. I knew that there was Jefferson and Hamilton. I knew there was national and state emphasis on things. That when he called me a Jeffersonian, it was like him saying, "Your mother wears army boots." Okay? And what he was really trying to do was throw my golf game off. But he didn't understand that I didn't get the point. He's a Hamiltonian. And that really struck me as I was reading the book over the last couple of days and coming down here to the AEI, which is very near the heart of Jefferson land, not just geographically, but intellectually. And so what I'm going to talk about a little bit is a point that comes up throughout the book, which is, why has Hamilton not always been famous? Why has he not always been the most important founding father? And I'll talk about that a little bit. But I also want to relate this experience that I had with Dick, which was that he changed my life. I'll be 65 in June, and you look back over the course of your life and you think about the people who really have made a difference in your life, and there's just absolutely no doubt that my life would have been tremendously different if Dick hadn't been part of it. I was going to work on the 1930s. I was going to write about labor markets and social welfare programs. My intention was to sort of start in the 1930s and work up through the Great Society to the present. And instead, we started collecting this data, and Dick says, "Oh, hey, look, there's this stuff on banks. We ought to be writing papers about banks in the 1830s. So now, I'm an economic historian of the early 19th century. I still write about government finance, and I write a lot about banks. And I write a lot about politics and economics and how they interact with one another. And that was partly because Dick and I and John wrote papers about this and really got fascinated in these questions about how did America develop, what was going on. So one of my favorite papers is a paper we wrote called The Interaction of Taxation and Regulation. It's about early 19th century banking. And then we wrote a paper in 1992 called Debt, Default, and Revenue Structure, which was about the state defaults in 1841 and 1842. In Maryland, Pennsylvania, and 6 other states defaulted, along with the territory of Florida, on their debt. 5 of the states repudiated it, never paid it back. In fact, there's a clause in the Arkansas Constitution that says, the state legislature of Arkansas shall never repay the Holford bonds for a variety of reasons. And so I got really involved in this, and what Dick kept talking to me about and teaching me was state history really matters, and we don't know enough of it. So my life really became, this paper we wrote in 1992 is the single most important paper I ever wrote. And it's never been published. In fact, we think that one of the editors of the Journal of Economic History thinks he accepted it, but we read his letter of acceptance as a rejection, and so we're still working on it. Okay, it's in the ball's in Dick's court. But well, that's what he says. So we haven't. But what it led me to do was to think about this interaction between economics and politics, and how do we do that? Now, what's really interesting is that Dick now believes that Alexander Hamilton essentially, like Helen of Troy, launched 1,000 ships. And I'm still, wait a minute. Yeah, Hamilton did all this really great stuff, and he was a great guy. He was very smart. He really understood a lot of stuff. But we had to figure out how all this stuff worked. And it didn't all happen because of Alexander Hamilton. As we all know, you can read all the right stuff that you want, but actually making it work in practice is much more difficult. And so I still feel like I'm carrying out the mission that I learned from Dick. He changed my life. I work on the 19th century, not the 20th century. I work on banks, not on welfare. I think about how politics and economics interacted and how we should explain those kinds of things. And that, in a sense, is why Hamilton is so important, because he bridges. So here's the economic theory of how financial markets should work. And here's the guy who actually then, as an actor rather than a thinker, as a doer rather than a thinker, changed the way our government behaved at the very beginning of its history as a national government. The first banks, however, were chartered by states. Just remember that. That's my takeaway, okay? Now, what about Hamilton? Why does he not, does he go in and out of favor? And Dick's already talked about one of these things. One of these, and I'll come to in a second. One of the things is that, why did Americans revolt? And this is a huge topic, lots of literature about it. One of the things that Americans clearly worried about, what's happening in Britain, is that the political actors in Britain were manipulating economic interests, things like who owned stock in the Bank of England or who owned the national debt, particularly members of Parliament, in order to get them to form a political coalition. This was called corruption then. Not venal corruption in the sense of these guys trying to make money for themselves, but how do you get members of Parliament or political actors to vote with you? How do you build a coalition? So I've written a couple papers where I call this the concept of systematic corruption. But Hamilton, and this comes through really nicely in Dick's chapters, Hamilton said, we need to get the interest of powerful people aligned with the government. There's a nice paragraph in the report on public credit about this. Now, if you were, obviously he was paying attention to what people are saying in the 1760s and 1770s as Americans decide to revolt, you would say, whoa, wait. That's exactly what we are revolting to get rid of. And so Madison and Jefferson said, no, this isn't a good idea. So Hamilton also generated competitive party politics because Jefferson and Madison, immediately after reading the report on public credit, say, we need to have another political party. And so Hamilton, when you go back and read that, is on another side of the street. Okay? Hamilton continuously says we need to align the interests of powerful people with the government. Now, personally, I think that's a good thing, although it's a problematic thing. How do you get it with competition? I've just been reading a New Yorker article about Putin. Putin's trying to align the powerful interests of people in Russia with the government, and that's not a good thing. But Hamilton is hard. It has a very subtle notion to his ideas, and there's a conflict there. Or not a conflict, but it's a paradox that you have to work out. Hamilton clearly wanted to promote efficient and rational financial markets, so he wanted to secure property rights and that good stuff. And so there's a strain of things at AEI that, yes, that's right, we need secure property rights, we need contract law, we need to honor these commitments, right? And then Hamilton said, we need a government that intervenes in these markets and promotes economic development. Okay? Forget this free market stuff. We need protective tariffs. We need to be involved in the economy. Dick has some nice sentences about this, about Adam Smith. You know, is it Adam Smith versus Alexander Hamilton? Okay? Now that, when you read it, it's hard because the way the world is played out, those have become opposites, where Hamilton saw them as part of the same approach. Now, actually, I'm with Alexander Hamilton on this one, because it seems to me as I look around the world that the government in the United States is not broken. We're having some wobbles. We always have some wobbles. I would much rather live here than Mexico or most of any other places. And if I look at the places that are developed, finance is really important. Yes, it's because we have a government that more or less works. Badly, perfect, and it's not perfect, right? But the places that don't work are places where the government, like Argentina, takes 25,000 people out of their homes in the middle of the night and drops them in the ocean. That's the typical government societies have, not the one we have. There is no better past. And Hamilton understood that. Hamilton understood, how do we craft a government that works, that promotes financial development in a world in which it's really hard to enforce rights and it's hard to enforce laws. So I love Dick Sylla. You know, he's one of my, he's not just a dear friend, but he's one of those people that changed my life, you know, that I look back on and say, I would be a different person if I hadn't met him. And so I hope that you guys get a chance to meet him a little bit too by reading this book. Thank you.
So Dick, I obviously did a horrible job picking out critics.
Yeah, I would criticize these guys. I mean, this session was supposed to be about Alexander Hamilton, not Dick Sylla.
Well, this is all very interesting, and this was really great. Let's move to the audience. We got maybe 15 or 20 minutes here of questions. Wait for the microphone, and then after that we have to move to let Dick sell and sign some books. So why don't we go right up here, up front here? A mic is going to, yeah.
It's coming.
It's coming.
Here it is.
Professor, you appear to be the reincarnation of Hamilton. So, Professor Hamilton, so what is your bank trying to accomplish with quantitative easing, zero interest rates, and zero interest rate policies? Can you enlighten us?
Well, those weren't the policies of my bank. My bank was the Bank of the United States, and it lent money at 5% and 6%, and lent a lot to. But to tell you the truth, I really needed that bank, because when I said that we're going to assume all the state debts and pay back fully all of the national debts, including the foreign debt, frankly, I didn't have the money to do that. This was my biggest gamble, that somehow things would work out. And so one of the reasons I was able to do that when the government really had very little revenue to make all these interest payments on the debt was I invented this Bank of the United States. And sure enough, over the course of my term as Secretary of the Treasury, I borrowed $6 million from that bank. The bank got really mad at me. They said, we want to make some loans to the economy. You're Hamilton, you're taking all the money of the bank and lending it to the federal government. But that was necessary, because when I came in, there was no money in the Treasury, and there was no revenue coming in. It took time while I was Secretary of the Treasury to build up this revenue. By the time I left, the money was coming in. But in between, I had to borrow money from the Dutch, I had to borrow money from the Bank of the United States, I had to borrow money from the other banks in the United States. And and all the time, to keep Jefferson and Madison happy, I had to say, things are fine, things are fine. And I told Washington that, and he backed me up on that. And so,
over here in front.
So, how is wealth created after the American Revolution? Let me just think that there were taxes, and part of the problem became people didn't want to pay them, so there was Shays' Rebellion. And then the other part was an empire that America filled into. The the areas that were west of the Appalachian Mountains, the Ohio Valley, indigenous lands that America expanded into, especially Hamilton was who had probably gotten out of the Society of the Cincinnati a large tract of land as part of his payment. So this is the creator of wealth, right? This expansion of the empire and taxation. Is that pretty accurate?
Well, I think the wealth was created by John, I think, mentioned that Hamilton was in favor of tariffs, but his tariffs were for revenue. That was the way the federal government was financed. It was getting the money to pay the interest on the debt by taxing imports. And the taxes on imports were actually quite low under Hamilton. We became a protectionist country about 20 years later in 1816, I think. Hamilton's tariffs were 5, 10, 15%, were designed to bring in revenue. The worst thing of all would be pure protection, letting no foreign goods in the country, then the United States government wouldn't have had a revenue. But the wealth was created by the trade of American merchants, businessmen, entrepreneurs in places like Paterson, New Jersey, built factories there, borrowing money from banks and having investors invest in the stock. The New England textile industry was built with bank loans. I think the wealth was, Adam Smith contrasted his views with those of the mercantilists. The mercantilists thought that what the wealth of a nation was the amount of gold in the king's treasury. And Adam Smith said, no, the wealth of a nation is the farms and the factories, and Hamilton agreed with that. I mean, that was his view as well. And I think he unleashed these entrepreneurial powers through the availability of credit. And things like the bonds that he issued became, a lot of businessmen owned those bonds. They collateralized them for loans at banks. I mean, it was a nice investment for them when they had idle funds to buy the bonds, and then if they needed money, they'd collateralize them for loans. It was like, that was part of the modern financial. So the wealth was created by entrepreneurs and, and obviously Southern planters who supplied Britain with cotton for the British Industrial Revolution. I mean, it's the real economy, but I think one of the things you might have picked up today is that the real economy depends a lot on the financial system and the financial economy. They're not something separate. When I was a young economist, you'd go to a cocktail party, you're an economist. Oh, tell me about the stock market. And then economists would say, well, the stock market, that's just repricing old pieces of paper every day. It has nothing to do with the real economy. That's what economists felt. And economists, even as late as 2008 and 2009, were sort of flabbergasted by this financial economy that had nothing to do with anything, some macroeconomists said, all of a sudden seemed to be sinking the economy. They were, so economists haven't paid enough attention to the financial system. But it's the real economy that creates wealth, but it does it with the support of the financial system. I think that's what Henry was saying last night. So that's the real wealth of the economy.
Why don't we go right in the middle back here, and then we'll get one from over there.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a great discussion. I've been reading Ron Chernow's book about Hamilton over again, and it seems to me that when you look at that book, the key thing was the support of Washington. When he tried to do some of these financial things without the government's support, he couldn't do it. And later on, during the 19th century, the banking system became problematic when you didn't have a government that understood or tried to work with the banking system. So it seems to me that this discussion in many ways leaves out, I understand we're at AEI, I was here for 3 years, I like this place, but the role of government gets relatively short shrift here. And the Hamilton depended on political support. And I think that is still the case, even though a lot of people would like to say that this is all in the financial system, the economic system. It depends, in my view, on government. And I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I agree with you that and I think maybe we said it, that somebody said it, perhaps myself, that Washington's support, Washington backed up Hamilton most of the time, which is always interesting because you might have thought that Washington, being a Virginia slaveholder like Jefferson and Madison, might have sided with them. But he went against them because he saw that Hamilton's policies were working. Jefferson came in and complained about Hamilton, and Jefferson comes pretty close to saying to Washington, after telling him that the economy is going to hell in a handbasket, Jefferson is almost in the position of saying, "Who are you going to believe, George? Me or what you can see with your own eyes?" And Washington went around the country and saw it was pretty prosperous, and so he believed what he could see with his own eyes, and Jefferson was frustrated. But I think, I think the general point of political support for the financial system, that's maybe we overdid it with bailouts and things like that, but the government needs to support the financial system just as the financial system is a support of the government. And that's what Alexander Hamilton realized more than other people, that these two things went together pretty well.
Let's get Alex over here.
Thank you, Alex Pollock of the R Street Institute, and thanks to all of you for a terrific panel. It was most interesting and most fun. If we look at Hamilton with his undoubted brilliance, and I'm not speaking now of mistakes in his personal life, but in his intellectual, professional life, are there notable mistakes that he made where he was just wrong or got it backwards or something that we should think about, as well as all the accomplishments?
Yeah, I would say that the one I think of a lot is his central bank, the Bank of the United States. He was warned a little bit. I think it was Fisher Ames, the congressman from Massachusetts, or maybe another Boston businessman that wrote him at the time and sort of recommended that the Bank of the United States absorb the several other banks that existed. There were three, I think, or maybe four. One in Boston, one in New York, one in Philadelphia, and one in Baltimore. And this person in 1790-91, when Hamilton is launching the Bank of the United States, says, some of us think you'd better absorb those state banks, otherwise they'll become a problem down the road. And Hamilton was a very smart guy, and he got this advice from someone, but he didn't seem to see it, And of course, after he died in 1804, by that time there were, be somewhere between 50 and 100 state banks that had been started by state legislatures, and the advice that Hamilton got turned out to be true, that these state banks began to say, if we got rid of the Bank of the United States, it would be a win-win-win proposition. We would get rid of a competitor, because the Bank of the United States, unlike the Federal Reserve, actually made loans to the private economy. We would get rid of a competitor. We'd get rid of a regulator, since it was the biggest bank and collected the government's revenues. It had a way of controlling by returning the notes that were issued by state banks. So you get rid of a competitor, you get rid of a regulator, and then if you got rid of that bank, the government has to bank somewhere, so we'll get the business. And so the states began to see that if we got rid of the Bank of the United States, that would be good for our state legislatures and our politics. And Hamilton probably should have seen that, especially since somebody was warning him about it. In so many ways, he did see the future. But in this particular case, maybe he was too naive in thinking that he was very suspicious of the states. That's partly why he was such a strong centralizer. He thought the states were the problem of the 1780s. State politicians, didn't want to. It's like Europe today. They have a hard time forming a union there because, the French and German and Italian and Spanish and politicians don't really want to surrender their sovereignty to some kind of European union. That was what America was like in the 1780s. The state governments didn't really want to, the leaders of them didn't want to give up their prerogatives by having a stronger central government. And Hamilton was against the states for that reason. And so he probably should have been able to foresee that down the road the states aren't going to like the nationally chartered bank, but he didn't seem to see it.
Let's take a question from back in that corner.
Thank you. Kent Watkins, following on that question directly, would you comment a little more on the fact that you mentioned in your book that Jackson vetoed the central bank, and it was many, many decades until the Federal Reserve. So what happened during that time? That's what is not clear to me. Were they able to exist for all those decades? and we see shadows and echoes of that today. If we get rid of the Federal Reserve, what will happen?
So yeah, I mean, the Congress fails to renew the first Bank of the United States in 1811. Then we fight the War of 1812, and the people who were against the bank in 1811, you know, I just read some book on the War of 1812. It was kind of an embarrassment to the United States. I mean, we were, you know, Jefferson thought our untrained militias would take over Canada in a few minutes or a few days, and that didn't work out. And, you know, the British burned some buildings not too far from here. I mean, it's a bit of an embarrassment. And so they realized during the war that you needed a central bank. So right after the War of 1812, we chartered the second Bank of the United States, which is basically the first Bank of the United States multiplied by 3.5. You know, 10 million of capital becomes 35 million of capital, and a few other. So then, you know, that bank, you know, has a rocky start, but it works well in the 1820s going into the early 1830s. And then Andrew Jackson, who I understand is you know, a kind of popular at a house nearby at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The Andrew Jackson doesn't like the Bank of the United States, and it's almost the same argument as in 1811. If, you know, Jackson's friendly bankers say, if we got rid of the second Bank of the United States, we would get rid of a competitor, get rid of a regulator, and the government would have to give us their business. So it's a powerful political economy argument for getting rid of the central bank. And Jackson pushed it through. Congress actually rechartered the second Bank of the United States. Jackson vetoed it, and his veto was couldn't be overcome. So your other question was, well, then what happened? You know, how do we go on until 1914 without a central bank? Well, you know, we had a pretty highly developed financial system. You remove that part of it. It doesn't seem to have slowed the growth of the country, but it didn't speed it up either. Some people like to say, oh, once you got rid of this oppressive Bank of the United States, the country did a lot better. The statistical evidence doesn't support that. Basically, the country was growing at a fairly constant rate from the 1790s all the way up to the 20th. It's even the 21st century. It's the last few years when we slowed down from the long-term rate of growth. So I've studied this and I've written about it. Basically, you had the sort of same rate of growth because the country had a lot going for it, but you had many more financial crises. You know, the Panic of 1837, John Wallace has shown us there was another panic in 1839, and we talked about the states defaulting on their debts in 1841. There's a panic in 1857, one in 1873, lesser one in 1884, one in 1893, one in 1907. And so the U.S. has all these financial crises when you don't have a central bank. Britain, Bank of England, begins to behave like a central bank about the middle of the 19th century, and other countries start central banks. They don't have all these crises. Congress acts slowly, you know, but by 1907, we're the biggest economy in the world, and we're having embarrassing financial crises, so they have a National Monetary Commission studies the world, and what do they come up with? Geez, we need a central bank. So they start a central bank, and then the 20th century, you know, we've had some problems. We've had 2007 to 2009, we had the 1930s, but, you know, much less frequency of financial crises. So what happened was, by getting rid of the central bank, we didn't harm the growth of the economy much, but we made it much less stable, which made it riskier and all that. And you didn't need to do that. It was like shooting yourself in the foot.
So I think we're going to have to stop here. We need to leave some time for some wine and cheese and some offline discussions, and for Dick to sign some books. So I want to very much thank all the panel members, Dick and all the experts who are here today. It was a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much. I know I enjoyed it. And one final note, if ever you go through a week and you think you've done a lot, pick up this book and read it and see all the things Alexander Hamilton did in his lifetime. But he didn't do the first American cookbook, and he didn't do the national anthem. So you got to get that in the next book, Dick. All right, thanks.